Yo, just a quick reminder, we got new shirts over at thepixelempire.com, so after the video, go check those out. Long-running game franchises are starting to run into a problem that some anime has. This overwhelming feeling of too much. You see something from like One Piece and think to yourself, oh man, this looks interesting. I might want 16 days non-stop, are you kidding me? Video games are starting to get to that point, which is why we're probably seeing constant reboots these days. For example, it's a perfect time to reboot Mega Man X. How am I supposed to keep up with that lore? How many times is Zero gonna blow up? But more and more games are doing the James Bond thing. Just making a character like Mario or Sonic, and then tossing them into various predicaments. Sprinkle on a couple familiar elements across all the games, and bang, you got yourself a hit. So the long-running Japanese RPG series Final Fantasy is almost 32 now. Oh, Heidelun. Final Fantasy 15 describes itself as a game for fans and first-timers, and I'm not really sure if I agree with that. People come to me sometimes asking where to start with the series, if they should do it numerically. Should they start at 7? And honestly, it's a really hard question to answer. Each world has a different appeal, different themes, combat systems, characters, and varying degrees of depression. If you toss somebody into the wrong game, that might be it. They might just turn it off, no more Final Fantasy. You know, like the people who just played Mystic Quest. Those poor people. So yo, it's Austin, and today we're gonna be doing the impossible. We're gonna be taking a look at every Final Fantasy and figuring out which one's the best for newcomers. That way, when you're done with this, you can be like, hey, I've never played a Final Fantasy before, I'm gonna give it a shot. And if not you, maybe your grandma or your dead relatives. Just remember, I'm objectively correct. Now, I actually have 2 answers I want to give out, but I'm going to save that for the end because we're going to go through all of them, and who knows, you might be more interested in one that I mentioned before that. Let's do it. Yay, let's go. Final Fantasy 1, released in 1987. This was like a last resort to Square possibly dying out, and if I had to describe it in one word, it would be old. It is a very old game at this point, but it was like extremely influential when it was released, considering it, you know, saved the company and maybe changed the face of JRPGs forever. The story's kind of like, hey, there's an evil in the world and you gotta take care of it, so you set up your 4 characters and you can only name them like with 4 letters, so their names are like Bob and Ir. But they don't really have any personality because they're just basically like vassals for you to play. You get to like choose a class, one of the like mini Final Fantasy jobs, and that's pretty much the game. It's very basic, it's an NES game. And it's more like Dungeons and Dragons than it is like a modern Final Fantasy, despite introducing us to a lot of concepts like the crystals and the job system. But is it a good place to start? It's a very gamey game, and the only reason I would see anyone starting with this one is if they wanted to start chronologically. That's it. Next, Final Fantasy 2, released in 1988, just 1 year later. Square was like, we got a hit, ship another one out, ship out another, and it sucks! Look, Final Fantasy 2 has got its supporters. All like 5 of you out there, but it is not a good follow-up to Final Fantasy, and it's not a very good game. In Final Fantasy 1, it was this turn-based system where anytime you killed a monster, they would give you experience points, but in Final Fantasy 2, it's a lot closer to your Elder Scrolls, where your stats only get a boost whenever you hit a thing. You get skill points from utilizing your skills, basically. So if you're just trying to like go through the game, killing stuff, you're not gonna be able to do it because you haven't been grinding. But the best way to grind is to just, you know, you go into a battle and you pull out your sword and you just like stab yourself in the shoulder until you're stronger. This is like shonen anime logic. However, it was the first Final Fantasy to give us like Cid and the Chocobo, and I love the Chocobo, meaning it's the best Final Fantasy. You should start with that. Just kidding. Don't. In fact, if there's one Final Fantasy I would think you should skip in general, it would be 2. However, Firion is a pretty cool design and is extremely overpowered in Dissidia NT, but the burning question remains, should you start with Final Fantasy 2? Final Fantasy 2 is a good place for beginners if they hate themselves. Final Fantasy 3, released in 1990, was the hot sequel to Final Fantasy 2 that made that game look like shit. Okay, remember Final Fantasy 2, let's just forget about that and then go back to 1 and then try that better. That makes sense, right? They like tried to like have more story elements, but they didn't have the main characters be actual characters again. Instead, the story's like this isekai thing where 4 magical warriors get transported into like some random cave, and then they talk to a crystal, and the crystal's like, yo, what's up? Oh yeah, we're gonna put on this warrior outfit, we're gonna cosplay and kick some ass, just like Sword Art. But the main hook here was the job system. Now, you would unlock these jobs as you play, but basically, your jobs are like your classes, except any character can switch between them at any point. So you start with your basics, like your warrior, your black mage, your white mage, who cast all different types of spells and stuff. Then you unlock like summoner, you unlock time mage. I don't know if time mage is in 3, I can't remember. But then you would level up these individual classes, and you got to design the type of party that you wanted to design without it being like Dragon Quest 3, where you walk into a town and you're like, hey, can I have like some type of healer? And they're like, yeah, here you go, dog. Take him, we don't want him. Get him out of here. It's definitely the best of the NES games, considering it takes elements from both of the ones before it and kind of expands it. And not just like in the way that the battles are no longer restricted to a window, but like full screen type of deal, like standard full screen, but still. Now, the NES version did not come out over here in the States, but we did get the DS and PC re-releases. These actually have a super cute style and look great, but this game is notoriously difficult, so I don't really think it's a good place to jump into. But the PC version did take those faceless characters and make them into actual characters. You got Luneth, Ark, Ingus, and Refia. So like there's story and interaction there, but it's still really hard and grindy as all hell. Final Fantasy III is a really good place to start if you want to play the best of the NES games and you want to see the series evolve from there. Final Fantasy IV, released in 1991, also known as Final Fantasy II, because 2 and 3 were too hard, I guess. Now, Final Fantasy IV was actually my proper introduction to the series, because I'm not gonna count Mystic Quest. Yes, that was my first Final Fantasy. It turned out okay. I hope. This is the first time the series tried to have a proper story with character arcs, and that's probably because they upgraded from the NES to the Super Nintendo. Final Fantasy IV might seem generic by 2019 standards, but back then it did a lot. You follow Cecil Harvey initially on his quest as a disillusioned knight, and he's like, oh man, I'm tired of killing people, dog. I want to be good. So he like tries to become good, and then it turns out the king's bad and stuff like that. I mean, this is all very obvious from like the first 5 minutes of the game. But his journey's really interesting because he already has a love interest prior to the game starting. He already has friends. It's not like, I'm gonna go out and make a name for myself. No, he's a feared knight, and he's gonna Vegeta. That's right, this game is basically about becoming Vegeta. Characters are set classes this time around, like Rosa's the dedicated white mage, or Edge is a dedicated ninja, and you don't really get to swap your party around so much as you are presented with certain characters at certain points in the game. It's been like ported to pretty much everything at this point, but there's 2 specific remakes that I like a lot. There's the DS and PC one, which is very similar to the Final Fantasy III remake we talked about earlier. This one has like fully voice-acted cutscenes and like choreographed moments of some of the cooler things that happen in the game, so whenever I'm thinking about 4, I'm like, oh yeah, this is definitely the canon version of Cecil. But that's right, but the PSP version of Final Fantasy IV is extremely good. If you don't want anything fancy with the 3D, because there are some issues with like the frame rate and stuff, the PSP version is in 2D, but it takes those original Super Nintendo sprites and just like fleshes them the heck out. Final Fantasy IV is a classic Final Fantasy in the purest sense, and it's a good starting point for anyone, especially for people who want to try the 2D ones. I like it. It's a good game. I like it! Final Fantasy Mystic Quest, 1992. Hot take. Mystic Quest is better than people give it credit for. Like, I genuinely believe that. I think that if this is your first time playing any kind of RPG, or hell, even the first time playing a video game, Mystic Quest is actually a pretty good place to get started. Japan believes so, certainly, because they called it Final Fantasy USA, implying that we're all a bunch of idiots, which, I mean, fair. It's pretty generic, it just does the 4 crystals, save the world type of thing, but the battle music's real good, man. I got to play the Mystic Quest songs on Theatrhythm in the Japan arcade machine, and it was awesome. Everyone should do that. Final Fantasy Mystic Quest was my starting point for the series, and look at me! I'm just fine! Mystic Quest will either turn you on or completely turn you off from all Final Fantasies, so is that a risk that you're willing to take? Final Fantasy V, also released in 1992. This never came out in the United States until the PlayStation 1 and that Final Fantasy Chronicles release, and it's like not even a good port because it has like loading times from a Super Nintendo game. That's no good. But there's also Final Fantasy V Advance, which is a pretty decent port with an extra dungeon, boss fight, but then the music's not as like powerful. But then there's also a mobile port, which just ruins everything. So it's like, which version of this game do you even play? The fan-translated ROM. 5 is really underrated in the West. I know we didn't get this one because the translation was taking a long time and then they were like, well, we might as well just do 6. But 5 does a lot of cool stuff. In this game, you follow Bart's or Butts and his friend Boko. Actually, as a whole, the characters in this game are pretty cool. I like Ferris a lot. She's like this pirate lord who kicks ass and everyone is scared of her. Even when they find out that she's a girl, they're even more scared of her. It spends a lot of time trying to make you laugh, which, you know, compared to 4, which was just depressing the entire time, is a pretty radical change. But it does have some extremely like tear-jerking moments like any Final Fantasy. If you had to play a Final Fantasy just for the battle system, this would be up there. 5 revisits the job system that 4 left behind, and it is just expanded. Everyone has a main level and a job level, and they learn new abilities and can pull them from each other, and they all have like unique sprites of their character in the job outfit. I like it, it's very cute. Final Fantasy V is also the first appearance of my main squeeze, my boy Gilgamesh. He's so stupid, he is so dumb. I love him. 5's a little bit hard to recommend a specific version of, but it's a good starting point if you want to see the best version of the job system. Second best, we'll get to that. Final Fantasy VI, released in 1994, also known as Final Fantasy III. I'm gonna be real with you guys right now. Final Fantasy VI is kind of a masterpiece. It has this large cast of fantastic characters, a well drawn out story depicting the fate of the world by an actual empire that you can see the inner workings of. It kind of revisits the thing that Final Fantasy II did, but you know, like good. Also, the bad guys have their characters developed, which is like not common and did not happen before this. Not to this extent. However, they did ditch the job system to bring us back characters with individual abilities. That being said, with Final Fantasy VI, you can switch the characters in and out of your party. So for example, Locke is a thief, and he does thief things. So if you feel like you need a thief, have him in your party, or maybe you just like him. It doesn't matter, you have the power. This game is split up into 2 parts, really. The second half came about because the developers allegedly were like, yo, we got some time, let's just put in the best part of the game. We didn't even think about this. 6 got big feels, it got big music, probably one of Uematsu's best scores, and it's a good place to start Final Fantasy if you're only gonna play one of the 2D ones. Though, I wouldn't start with 6, because it might make the earlier games kinda suck more. Final Fantasy VII, released in 1997, was the first 3D Final Fantasy. I'm pretty sure that Final Fantasy VII is a lot of people's starting point because it has the loudest fan base, it has the most copies sold, it had the biggest buzz when it was released, with people calling it the greatest RPG, nay, the greatest game of all time. And at that point in time, it might as well have been that, because it was real good. It was also the game that made people go like, hey, what happened in Final Fantasy 4 through 6? And then people responded to that with Super Mario Bros. 2 is actually a game called Doki Doki Panic. People like to rag on 7, they're like, look at these hands, they're just like bricks, this game's aged like crap, but I think that is naive and stupid. If you don't give a damn about graphics, Final Fantasy VII has barely aged, well, the translation leaves some to be desired. Like, hey, remember that time Tifa's calling people slurs? What a cool character. This one's pretty simple plot-wise. It's like, hey, you're an eco-terrorist, now go save the world. But why are you trying to save the world? Who are you really? Oh my god. That's the plot. Also, there's a bad guy with long hair. The combat system's pretty memorable and easy to use for newcomers as well. You get to use materia and you equip that into your weapons in order to use spells. So basically, if you don't have any materia equipped, you're kind of just like you're a stick, and you gotta put stats on that stick. So if you want to use fire, you put the fire materia on, and then you can cast fire. 7 does have a ton of minigames though, which are a lot of fun, like chocobo breeding, you can do squats, and of course, snowboarding. Final Fantasy. Airships aren't like new to the series or anything, but flying around in a 3-dimensional space is, and that's fun. Unless you count mode 7, in which case I'm just wrong. My only gripe here is that most of the characters are one note, and then they have their thing, and then they just kind of turn into drones who say, their thing. Oh, you know, Barrett's gonna be aggressive about this one. It might be a smart idea to wait for the remake, especially if you want a good translation, but that might take like 100,000 years. Especially considering remake only goes up to Midgar, which is like the first third of disc 1. It's gonna take 7 years. Pre-order for the exclusive Phoenix Down. I would say 7's a good starting point for Final Fantasy if you only want to play the 3D ones, which makes you a fool! Final Fantasy VIII, released in 1999, came out on the same day as the Dreamcast, and I did not play it initially because I did not have a PlayStation 1 at the time. With 7 and 8, I had to wait for the PC ports because I was like, I'm not gonna play that dirty PlayStation, I'm a Sega kid, and look what happened to me. Dreamcast. Final Fantasy VIII is like the Roman Reigns of Final Fantasy. It kind of just gets heat without even trying, only because Final Fantasy VII was the game that preceded it. When 8 came out, it was the most hyped Final Fantasy I could remember. I saw all the early forums being like, 8's gonna be so badass, look, the character models, they're like twice as tall, and the hands, they're like this. But then the game came out and it was this sentimental love story about an introverted person who struggles with identity and feeling like he has imposter syndrome, and everyone was like, what's this? I'm an alpha male gamer. But I liked it. 6 was like, hey, remember the romance? And then 8 was like, here's an entire game about two people having a hard time telling each other how they feel. After 7, this was the second Final Fantasy to just completely ditch the fantasy setting and a lot of the mainstays that we've had from that era. The inclusion of the crystals wasn't so obvious compared to previous entries. The main thing that turned people off here, besides the story, of course, and the really dumb thing that they did later in the game, was the junction and draw system. I always thought this was really easy to do. You just have to like read the tutorial where it's like, hey, this makes you stronger and you should do it. But then people were like, why am I getting my butt kicked? And it's because you're not supposed to grind in Final Fantasy VIII. In that game, the enemies scale in difficulty with you, so you're supposed to spend more time being smart and maybe not grinding. I've kind of joked about it with previous entries, but Final Fantasy VIII is a definite no-go when it comes for a starting point to the series. It's so unlike a lot of the games that come before and after it. I would only try this one out once you get your feet wet. Then you can look at Squall's block face. Well, not in the remake. They removed the pubes! Final Fantasy IX, released in 2000. Y'all already know how I feel about this one, especially if you've been keeping up with the channel. I love this game. It is probably my favorite Final Fantasy. However, I do not think it's a good starting point because of a couple reasons. It's pretty slow, especially compared to other games in the series. Now, you can like skip past that with the speed up that the remake has, but also considering it's like a celebration of Final Fantasy, there's gonna be a lot of things that go over your head or things that you won't appreciate. However, I do think that the narrative is the best that the series has to offer, so if you don't really care about the nostalgic things, it's a pretty good starting point. And since it's so slow-paced and you pretty much have to use the speed up feature to get around that, it's not going to be very exciting for newcomers. Final Fantasy Tactics bonuses! This one's not like your typical Final Fantasy, obviously. This is a tactics game. So, it's not a great starting point for Final Fantasy unless you already like strategy RPGs. I know there's going to be a lot of people who have played like the crap out of your Disgaias or Disgaea, but it was one of the introductions to Ivalice, which is one of the more interesting and deep Final Fantasy worlds that we are going to come back to. But I can't see this being many people's starting point to Final Fantasy, considering the only things they have in common are like jobs and chocobos. It is a fantastic strategy RPG with an incredibly engrossing story and characters and a soundtrack that is unlike Nobuo Uematsu stuff, but still really good, but it's not as good as Tactics Ogre Let Us Cling Together. Final Fantasy X, released in 2001 near the beginning of the PlayStation 2's lifespan, and finally, a Final Fantasy with voice acting. It's not that bad. Stay away from the summoner! It's the best line in that game. Back then, Square was making that big money from all those Final Fantasies and all those PlayStation 1 games, so they're like, alright, let's just put this into a big-ass PS2 release and release the biggest game of the generation, and they sure knocked it out of the park. The premise of 10 is not a simple one. You control Tidus, a blitzball player who ends up getting sucked into a giant thing in another Final Fantasy isekai moment. Hello! From there, you kinda just try to make your way and try to figure out what the heck is going on. Everyone's like, look at this stupid kid, he has amnesia, ha ha ha.
You probably shouldn't laugh anymore.
And you're like, no, I don't have amnesia, I'm just really confused, which fair.
I need food.
People are speaking other languages around you. There's like a really hot girl with a stick who can control bird dragons, and some old ladies like, stay away! Final Fantasy X kind of feels like a combination of Final Fantasy V and 8, which, hold on. Do you like class customization? You got the sphere grid. Do you like romance? Well, boy howdy, this is for you. 10 is kind of divisive among the fans, but I think it's got a lot of merit. Each of the characters goes through a lot of development over the course of the game. Yes, that means even the racist Uncle Waka goes through something to make him slightly less racist. The divisiveness is like, some people hate it, and then some people think it's the best Final Fantasy, which I certainly do not agree with, especially because someone thought it was a good idea to make you have to dodge 100 lightning bolts to get an item, and why would you do that? However, I would say Final Fantasy X is a good starting point if you want to play something that feels modern. Final Fantasy X-2, released in 2004. Easily the best combat system, and the worst story. Job system? Dress spheres? Don't start with it though, it's a sequel. The only direct sequel. Well, besides a couple others. Final Fantasy XI, released in 2002. Remember that time Square Enix decided they were gonna try to make an MMO? Well, they did it! And they did it before World of Warcraft did it, because they were like, all right, you see this EverQuest game, we like that. You see this World of Warcraft game, that don't exist. It's 2004, 2 years later. So remember that. This game is more tedious than World of Warcraft. This game is more tedious than World of Warcraft in the vanilla stages. Here's a personal story. Final Fantasy XI has this fantastic story, but I'm unable to experience all of it when you put like a level cap increase quest where I have to go to this dungeon that you have to manually enter 3 words as a password in, but those words reset every hour, so you have to like go through this dungeon, find the passwords, get to the top of the dungeon, manually enter the passwords, and then you can get to the item if you do not die, which you're probably going to die! Especially because the AI trust system that they implemented is completely useless when it comes to stuff like that, and no one's gonna play and help some newbie like me, like cast invisible on me and be like, go child, go into the free yonder. So yeah, it's not like I just spent like 2 hours trying to do one quest and fail and then rage quit for like a couple months. That didn't happen. Final Fantasy XI is a good starting point if you're a masochist. Final Fantasy XII released in 2006, 4 years after Final Fantasy XI came out, and to be honest, it's one of my top 3. There's a common complaint about Final Fantasy XII, and I'm just gonna address it right now. People are not a fan of this Aladdin-ass looking motherfucker, Vaughn. And Penelo also. They're like, he's a bad character, he has nothing to say, but let me tell you something right now, that character's you! You are Vaughn. You are the one who is being represented there because he's supposed to be a dumb young kid. He's supposed to be the one that doesn't know anything. And in the world, Ivalice, that this takes place in, he is a fragile baby. 12 is interesting because it goes into more of the political side of the spectrum, exploring the same kind of thing that 2 and 6 did with the Empire. But this time, there's no clear-cut answer on who the bad guy is. In fact, 12 doesn't like to draw a line in the sand. Just little tomato guys instead. A majority of this game takes place in the desert outside of a city called Dalmasca, where there's like a bunch of political refugees happening. There's a lot of inner turmoil. It takes place directly after one of the main character Ash's weddings, where then the war happens and then someone dies and then everything is just sad. We see that through a different lens. We see all these characters who I would consider the main characters, like Bosch, Ash, Balthier. Those 3 are the most central to the plot, and Vaughn's like, wow, the entire time. It's interesting though, because Vaughn is the one who's hurt the most by this stuff. I could talk about 12 forever. Basically what I'm trying to say, is this game a good starting point for Final Fantasy? No. No, it is not. It is the most radically different Final Fantasy of everything out there. The combat system's actually really similar to Final Fantasy XI, where it does like the slow-paced auto attack and you pick your commands that you want to do. It uses an AI programming thing called gambits, which is very similar to how controlling AI in Dragon Age works. This game's got a lot of like turmoil behind it, with a lot of controversy, including the like father of Final Fantasy, Hironobu Sakaguchi, and plenty of others leaving in the middle or right at the end of the entire development process. But I think that the game that came out is one of the most gorgeous PS2 games. It's an amazing remaster to play that fixes a lot of the gameplay issues. And the story goes in a direction that's like Star Wars, but good. It's not really representative of Final Fantasy and anything besides like, hey, there's a cactuar, hey, there's a chocobo, but Once you get your feet wet, just like Final Fantasy VIII, I highly recommend giving this one a shot, because it's one of the best, even though it should just be called something different. Final Fantasy XIII. Announced in 2006, delayed in the States until 2010, Final Fantasy XIII and its trilogy were hyped up big time, and I don't like them. But I'm not here to tell you about why I dislike this game for 30 minutes. I'm here to tell you whether or not it's a good starting point for Final Fantasy. So after going to like weird destinations for the last couple, Final Fantasy XIII is like, all right, we're gonna go to like the far future. Things are gonna be sci-fi, characters gonna have guns and stuff. One of them's gonna have like a gun that's like a gun blade, but not as cool. People are doing like fancy flips off of trains and stuff. In fact, for most of this game, the entire plot is about running away from the police. Why? Well, it's because God said that you're a heretic and you have to run away, but it doesn't really make any sense because the story is told out of order and at random intervals during other points in the game, and the characters are really flat except for like Saz, so it's like, I don't know what's going on. Squishy Mom here, you see her? She dies like immediately. She's just dead in like the first 20 minutes of the game, but then you keep seeing her in flashbacks and you're supposed to feel something, but it's almost like if they like restructured it so that, you know, that part came before she died, maybe sense would be made. The combat system really requires you to study the tooltips and have like spreadsheets of like efficient combos in order to really experience it properly. You can play with the auto attack mode, which is what most people bitched about, but that's not a good way to play this game. And I don't feel like studying either. But is it a good place to start Final Fantasy? Probably not, considering a large amount of the Western audience was pretty disappointed by it, but it still does look pretty. Destiny is destiny. Final Fantasy XIV. Remember that second time Square Enix tried to make an MMO? Yeah, well, it bombed real hard. Hard like, let's turn off the subscription model, let's add content considering we had 0 dungeons at launch. Let's make it so that the experience point system is able to be used, considering if you leveled up too much with one class at the beginning of the game, it would just cut you off, making you have to switch. And then, once we get everyone excited, let's end the world, let's literally kill everyone, turn off the servers, and then try it again. Truly a realm reborn. I actually played Final Fantasy XIV 1.0 for like 2 months. I don't know if I liked it or not. I certainly played it. I had a hard time, but since they brought it back with The Realm Reborn and the expansions Heavensward, Stormblood, and Shadowbringers, the game has gone from like probably the worst Final Fantasy to one of the best, which is crazy to think about. It's an MMO. It basically plays like World of Warcraft, which is how they revived it. And the story is you're the Warrior of Light, and you begin as like a guy who's like picking up garbage on the ground to throw away because some little Lalafell's like, hey, do this, mother Moogle. And then you're like saving the world, and there's huge dragons, and then there's armies fighting each other, and like, yeah, it's exponential. But should you start with Final Fantasy XIV? Maybe? It's got a lot of Final Fantasy motifs and references over the last 30 years built into it, so it has a fan service aspect, but it's not necessarily required to enjoy the game. If you're an MMO guy and you've never played a Final Fantasy, then yeah, I would definitely recommend it, but if you're like wanting to get into the narrative or play a single player RPG, probably not. That being said, if you want to play a Final Fantasy with friends, pick this, not 11. And lastly, Final Fantasy 15, released in 2016. Originally known as Final Fantasy Versus 13, we waited 10 years for this game. Was it worth it? Ah, yes, the game that called itself a Final Fantasy for fans and first-timers. It's a load of shit. I once called Final Fantasy 15 an unfinished masterpiece, and I still kind of agree with that. I think the makings for an amazing game are all there. You have a prince who's like, I need to go have a political wedding, and then he leaves, and then all the bad things happen, and he's like, wow, that sucks. I guess I'm gonna go get magical powers and save the day with my best friends. It's so generic, but the characterization and the moments they have is pretty solid. Unfortunately, you can tell that this is an unfinished game and one that they had to resurrect from the scraps of Tetsuya Nomura. It looks great, like especially visually, considering you have like all these hair wind physics and stuff. But to say that this didn't feel like the development hell patched together is an understatement. The open world is weird but memorable at the same time. The quests that you have to do in the field are pointless, and it just feels like two different games due to the linearity linearity that happens in the second half. You go from a giant open world to, all right, we're on the train to the end of the game now, let's go. I think there's a lot to like about Final Fantasy 15, and overall I do like it, especially with all the DLC and Royal Edition out. However, is it a good place to start? Now, I'm sure a lot of the younger people out there did start with Final Fantasy 15 because it's the first numbered Final Fantasy to come out in the last 9 years. But despite what Square Enix says, I wouldn't recommend starting at 15 because honestly, there's a lot better. It's not a bad game, it's just there's better. Also, Aranea's hot! So now that we've talked about all the Final Fantasies, why don't I tell you what I think? And the winner is 2 games, yay. While I'm tempted to say Mystic Quest for the memes, I personally recommend Final Fantasy 4 and 10 as fantastic starting points. One 16-bit, the other 128 emotion bit. If I had to pick just one, I would go with 4. Cecil's journey, the companions he makes along the way, and the fail cycles the story goes through aren't forgettable. If you're new to RPGs, you'll be eased into the active time battle system and can even toggle the speed at which it flows. Every moment in the game is balanced with the characters you have in your party, with certain moments making the player feel powerless, by design of course. For being the first game in the series to really attempt a character-driven story, they really knocked it out of the park. Certain moments will tug at your heartstrings, others will make you laugh due to the goofy localization back in the day. If you remember the You Spoony Bard thing before the meme, you're officially a boomer. Again, I would go with the PSP version of this one, the Complete Collection. The After Years sequel included is whatever, but the gameplay is the smoothest version of it out there. The DS and PC remake have weird frame rate issues, which can be fixed with modding, but the PSP one feels just right. It's the baby bear. Something, I don't know. It's just a really solid game no matter which version you choose, and the beginning of Final Fantasy understanding what exactly it is. 10, on the other hand, I picked for 2 reasons. A, Final Fantasy 4 is too old, and B, you want something easy to play. 10 does an excellent job at explaining its systems in detail. A lot of Final Fantasies, including my favorites, aren't really good at this. You pop in and you better understand elemental tables, job purposes, enemy weaknesses, and you better steal items constantly or you're gonna miss the good stuff. 10's like, okay kid, this here is Waka. He throws ball. Ball does big damage on Flyboy. Tidus can't hurt armor guy. Kimari's no good even though he's a Dragoon and Blue Mage, which is like the coolest combo of classes. The sphere grid and ability up system is really easy to understand, especially with the international version of the game having the expert grid, which allows you to really customize the characters you want to have. The story's not convoluted, the characters are mostly likable, and since the combat is turn-based, you can take time to think about your next move. By no means is it the most challenging or creative Final Fantasy, but it sure is the most accessible. As in, like, the game's easy to learn, but it's also on every platform you can dream of. When's the Apple Watch version? Also, it'll probably make you cry. Psst, alpha gamers start with Mystic Quest. Make sure to check out the new shirts on pixelempire.com and use the code Eruption, save 10%. I'm really happy with the shirts and I hope you guys like them too. Thank you all so much for watching. Special Patreon shout out to Alfredo Ariano, Brandon Howell, Christopher Olivia, Cliff Bro, Donald Dowdy, David Molnar, Eli Shane Stalfanekar, Flaming Fighter, Jacoby Fitzpatrick, Irrational, Jay Roos, Josh Garbage Lord, Legend Gary, Nitron, Plasma Phoenix, and Vlad Lust. Thank you so much for watching. And with that, we are done with the month of Square Enix. Like 2.5 months. Took me a minute, but we did it. We'll have one more video before Christmas and then we're gonna have a deep sleep. It'll be a good time. Anyways, I'll catch you guys next time. Bye-bye.